Hi to everyone. It's 4 o'clock in New York. Some news breaking late this afternoon from Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, the investigator leading the investigation into Donald Trump's hush money scheme. It appears enough is enough. The New York Times, under 4 bylines late this afternoon, was first to report this. Alvin Bragg is now going on the legal offense, taking the extraordinary step of suing Republican Congressman Jim Jordan for seeking to interfere with the ongoing criminal investigation. From that Times report, quote, the 50-page suit filed in federal court in the Southern District of New York accuses Jordan of a, quote, brazen and unconstitutional attack on the prosecution of Mr. Trump and a, quote, transparent campaign to intimidate and attack the district attorney. Lawyers for Bragg are seeking to bar Mr. Jordan and his congressional allies from enforcing a subpoena they sent to Mark Pomerantz. Mark Pomerantz was once a leader of the district attorney's investigation into Trump. He later wrote a book about the experience. Viewers of this program may remember he appeared here as well. Mr. Pomerantz resigned early last year after Mr. Bragg, just weeks into his first term in office, decided not to seek an indictment of Trump at the time. Mr. Bragg's lawyers also intend to prevent any other such subpoenas, the lawsuit says. Jordan has left open the possibility of subpoenaing Mr. Bragg. This is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. New York Times reporter Glenn Thrush is here. Also joining us, the former chief of staff at the Department of Defense. He had that job at the CIA as well. Jeremy Bash is back. Charlie Sykes is also back. He's editor-at-large of The Bulwark, an MSNBC contributor. Glenn Thrush, I start with you. I saw this cross our wire about an hour ago from 4 of your colleagues. Alvin Bragg doing what all the investigators who have come before him never really took the formal step of doing. I mean, Mueller was harassed incessantly, as were his 19 prosecutors. Andrew McCabe was harassed and run out of his job. Jim Comey was fired and harassed. Alvin Bragg suing top Trump ally, the jacketless Jim Jordan.
Yeah, there is a lot of back and forth going on. And I think one of the extraordinary elements of this is the fact that Bragg seems to have gotten, according to the court filing, 1,000 threats from his office from Mr. Trump and some of his supporters. And Jordan is intending to have a hearing in New York next week, I believe, maybe at the Javits Center is sort of what I've heard, with really the same intent that Marjorie Taylor Greene had on the day of the arraignment, to counter-program and to sort of, in their view, take the fight into the Democrats' hornet's nest. And I think what Bragg is doing here is attempting to let Mr. Jordan and other people know that you can't really come onto their turf in New York City and get away with this without a fight.
You know, Glenn, it also, I think, puts into stark contrast the reality, the political reality. The Jordan Committee was years in Jim Jordan's imagination in the making. It's been a colossal flop, even by Republican standards and reviews, which are frankly very, very low. All you have to do is enough to make your way into a Fox News rundown. They haven't succeeded at anything they set out to do themselves. And targeting Pomerantz and Bragg is almost like a reactive, the kind of thing you do when you're in the minority, right? And you're not in control of events. You're not setting the agenda. You're not holding the Benghazi. I mean, this is the bottom of the barrel, even for Trump's allies in the House.
Well, the guys in the House, the guys and girls in the House have a different agenda than others in their party. They can't afford to distance themselves from Trump. And what you're seeing here is them essentially supporting a former president who today polled at 25%. There's a substantial number of Republicans and an overwhelming number of independents who believe that Donald Trump did something wrong. So what they're doing is fighting a rear guard action that makes a lot of sense in these gerrymandered congressional districts, doesn't make sense in a national election, doesn't make sense necessarily in a Senate election, but they're sort of playing this out. And then the other thing, Nicolle, that I'm sure you've heard about is there seems to be a lot of disputes going on in terms of the in terms of the House majority. We're seeing conflict over the debt ceiling between Kevin McCarthy and his budget committee chair. But you're also seeing significant friction, according to my sources on the Hill, between Comer's investigation and Jordan's investigation. So they're really going fishing, and they haven't caught anything yet. So what now they're attempting to do, I think, are to stage these events to counter-program what Bragg did.
It's a great way of looking at this, Jeremy Bash. Jordan has gone fishing for Alvin Bragg, and Alvin Bragg with this lawsuit has snapped his fishing pole in half. Let me read you from the Bragg lawsuit. Quote, "The Judiciary Committee's subpoena to Mr. Pomerantz marks the first time in our nation's history that Congress has used its compulsory process to interfere with an ongoing state criminal case. The district attorney is likely to succeed on the merits because the committee's subpoena exceeds Congress's authority and obstructs New York's sovereign right to enforce its criminal law. The subpoena would also irreparably injure the district attorney by, among other things, interfering with an ongoing criminal case, compromising grand jury secrecy and the attorney-client privilege, and disrupting his preparation for trial." Can you imagine any scenario? And you look at Donald Trump's pardons. I mean, it's clear he sought to reach deep into the criminal justice system and undo and overturn the work of the judiciary all over this country. But to reach into an ongoing investigation into a politician by that politician's party is, as Bragg's lawsuit puts it, a first in our country.
Yeah, Nicolle, I served as chief counsel of a congressional investigative committee. I also served, as you referenced, in the executive branch. And when I was serving as an investigator on Capitol Hill, we oftentimes had to yield when the Department of Justice was conducting a criminal investigation. Even though there was a legitimate oversight function, we stepped back and we said, let the criminal prosecution and its process go forward. I think what you see here today is really an attempt to, by the legislative branch, to usurp the powers of the executive branch. Now, of course, in our three branches of government, we have different lanes in the road. But if the Congress of the United States is able to essentially say, we want to decide whether or not a criminal prosecution can go forward, then in effect, what you have is the Congress taking over the responsibilities of the executive to enforce the laws of the United States. And that's a total, I think, change to our democratic system, to our separation of powers. I understand, obviously, the Bragg matter is a state matter, not a federal matter, but the principle applies. You can't have Congress interfering in the criminal administration of the criminal code by the federal government or the states.
And Jeremy, the case has been filed. It's a federal lawsuit, right? It's been filed through SDNY. What does that mean? What will the first step be?
Well, in some respects, I think, oddly, Trump might have also wanted this case in federal court because ultimately he may want to try to bounce it up to the Supreme Court and argue that the state case by Bragg is preempted because it involves federal election law. And there's a doctrine of preemption in which federal courts can oversee the administration of federal laws. So oddly, both the Bragg team and the Trump team may be litigating aspects of this case in federal court before we know it. And that means it's likely going to head for the Second Circuit, which may be more friendly to the New York-based prosecutor. But I think, Nicolle, and I fear that ultimately this is going to go to the Supreme Court, and they're going to have to define the contours of just how far this case can go and how far Congress can go in interfering with it.
You know, Charlie Sykes, so often we come on the air with something that's broken in our politics and our democracy, and there's always a Trump aspect to it. But as Jeremy just said, this could end up before the Supreme Court, another institution that's at an historically low point in terms of the public's trust and confidence in it. Down, I think, 40 points since Gallup has been asking American voters the question of how they feel about the Supreme Court. What do you make of this real labyrinth now of cross pressures in Congress, in state court, in federal court, and now, as Jeremy just said, another case that may end up before the Supreme Court?
Yeah. Sooner or later, one of the many cases involving Donald Trump will end up in the Supreme Court. It seems almost inevitable. If it's not this one, it'll be another one. But what's really striking to me is that Alvin Bragg is bringing a gun to a knife fight. And unlike Robert Mueller, he is pushing back. And he is calling out Jim Jordan, very clearly for a move that is pure political retaliation. It is an attempt to intimidate. It is an attempt to obstruct justice. And it is an abuse of congressional power, but also just from a political point of view, going back to Glenn's earlier point. Think about what Jim Jordan, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, is doing. The willingness of Jim Jordan to put the work of the House, to subordinate the work of the House to loyalty to Donald Trump this early in their term. They have all of these other things that are on their plate right now, all of the other things that they could be doing. And Jim Jordan apparently has such a short leash from Mar-a-Lago that he is going to take this committee, this hearing, to New York City. It is interesting that Alvin Bragg is pushing back so hard and hitting all of these key notes, including the fact that this is a campaign to intimidate and to obstruct, and it is an abuse of power. So this is not a trivial or a technical point that Alvin Bragg is making.
Charlie, this was Jim Jordan's response, and I do like to afford them courtesies they don't afford to Earth One, where we try to get at the truth and the facts. This is Jim Jordan's response to the lawsuit on Twitter. First, they indict a president for no crime. Then they sue to block congressional oversight when we ask questions about the federal funds they say they used to do it. That's not why there's congressional oversight. Charlie's like, they don't even lie. They can't stop lying any more than they can stop breathing. I mean, the lawsuit makes clear that this is about interference in a criminal investigation. And the notion that if the Senate Democrats wanted to open up an investigation into, I don't know, the U.S. attorney in Delaware's probe into Hunter Biden, the Republicans would literally give birth to farm animals on live TV. They'd go crazy. They would go nuts. I mean, the idea that interfering in a criminal investigation is a job for Congress is something that Republicans and Democrats used to agree is a no-go. And I think what I'm getting at is something I was trying to get at yesterday. We have relied on the pitiful sort of gates of norms. And I think that when a story like this breaks, the reason we come in with it is because what Alvin Bragg is pushing against is something that now has to turn to the courts because the norm has been annihilated. The Republicans no longer respect that an ongoing criminal investigation is something they cannot meddle in. What is it, in your view, what does it look like to try to preserve some of these principles of the rule of law?
Well, you have to raise these issues. You have to push back. And I think one of the tragedies of the Mueller investigation was the asymmetry that Trump was playing by a completely different set of rules than Robert Mueller was playing by. And I think you made a reference to this. The obstruction of justice is very much a part of the Trumpian playbook. The Mueller report documented all the cases of obstruction of justice. But what I think that we have to recognize is that from Donald Trump's point of view, that obstruction worked. It succeeded. So it's not surprising that he and his other supporters would go back to the same playbook and perhaps would succeed here. But what I do think is interesting is the fact that Jim Jordan is playing this aggressively on this issue because he's completely out of his league now. He's out of his league. He's going to be in federal court, and he's not going to be able to finesse this on Twitter. I mean, remember before the election, Jim Jordan was the real man of political genius who put on the Republican House Judiciary Twitter account. Remember, it was something like Elon, Kanye, Trump. As if somehow those were the guiding lights. This is the guy. This is the history of this Twitter account. And now he's in a world in which he will be held account and where he has to tell the truth and where federal judges are going to ask him tough questions. And it may go up a little bit higher. But Alvin Bragg is also just calling him out and letting the world know, look, these people are attacking a legitimate criminal investigation. They are seeking to interfere. They are seeking to intimidate, raising the question of the threats, as opposed to just simply keeping your head down and hoping that the process and the system works without being aggressively defended. So I think we're seeing something about the aggressiveness of Alvin Bragg this early in the case.
I mean, Glenn, the mind is focused by threats to your life and your wife's life. And that is what Alvin Bragg's life has included since his probe neared this point where it was clear to Trump and the people around him that he would be charged. I want to ask you about the intersection with the threats of political violence and what Charlie's talking about, the success of Trump's obstructive conduct. I mean, other than Bill Barr, and it looks like based on an incredible Times body of reporting, Mr. Durham, Trump has had his way with the types of prosecutors who've sought to investigate him. And even when they found evidence of criminality, he has still managed to come out on top. Do you think there's something learned in the body politic, especially on the legal side, in terms of Bragg's response?
I think there's also sort of time and life cycle of investigations. You know, the Mueller investigation occurred on a president who was in an office, and you know, Barr's memo, famous or infamous, a precluded prosecution of a sitting president. So I think a lot of it has to do with that. But I also think we're dealing with a very different fact set. And I think January 6th changed absolutely everything. It was a concrete demonstration of what an insurrection looks like. And I think it steeled, to a great extent, both federal prosecutors and local prosecutors to take this a great deal further down the road.
Glenn, I'm going to have to ask you to follow up and expand on whether or not that analysis in your reporting suggests that Jack Smith also takes that view.
It seems, look, we can only go by, you know, we're in Plato's cave territory here, Nicolle. Like we're able to sort of discern who's going in. We're interviewing defense counsel to sort of see what questions are being asked. But on both the January 6th investigation and on the Mar-a-Lago documents investigation, things seem to be accelerating. And the one thing I would say, I did a piece last week that sort of looked at the overlap between Fani Willis's case down in Georgia and what Jack Smith is looking at in terms of the electors plot on January 6th. And there's a lot of pressure on Jack Smith to get to these witnesses, the witnesses that Willis is interviewing, either before or simultaneous with her. This is according to a bunch of former prosecutors, because you don't want to have a lot of witness testimony banging around. It just creates the possibility of problems, discrepancies in testimony. So to give you a long answer to a short question, Smith has a lot of incentive to move really, really quickly.
Jeremy, I'm intrigued by this idea that January 6th changed everything. I mean, I certainly, watching it, and I know Trump doesn't want us to believe our eyes, what we see and hear. That was part of his, I think it was the spring of 2017. That was his message in a debate to his own voters, people who came to his rallies. But those of us who saw what his movement became, that it became an unsuccessful coup, but an insurrection all the same, led by Trump, still cheered by Trump. Trump's current position on January 6th is that these are political prisoners and he will pardon them if he returns to the White House. What do you think? And I guess this has been part of my education in watching Trump's impact on the rule of law. Prosecutors are human beings, and where a lot of people, including myself, were disappointed that the Mueller report wasn't more clear. It didn't say in English 6 crimes of obstruction of justice were committed, and the day he leaves office, he should be charged criminally for them. It did, I think, leave a lot of people with the impression that the Mueller team blinked in the end. Do you think there's a detectable difference in how prosecutors and investigators handle Trump post January 6th?
Yes, I do think that, Nicolle. I've been talking to a lot of people overseas, friends of the United States, but not Americans, and they look at what's going on and they think to themselves, and they've said to me, you know, what January 6th showed us is it showed us exactly what Donald Trump thought of American democracy. When American democracy supported him, he was for it. When American democracy did not support him, he was completely against it, willing to tear down the institution, both metaphorically, but as well as physically, literally tear it down, attack it, send people to attack it. And that shows people around the world that if Donald Trump is elected president again, I have to say there are some people who believe that this whole Bragg situation actually makes it more likely that Trump will be the nominee, makes it more likely that he will kind of emerge from the primary heap on top. That if he becomes president again, we have no idea what he will do to American democracy. And that scares the living daylights out of our friends and allies around the world. And it should.
We need new words for living daylights, because I'm sure that's not the words they used. All right, I really do want to turn to what Glenn and I started talking about, and that is the impact and what we can deduce in the dark on the Jack Smith probe. So I'm going to ask all of you to stick around. And when we come back, I want to tell you about the other breaking news as we come on the air. A top Trump ally, his speechwriter, his voice, Stephen Miller, was in court today for many hours as Trump seeks to block the former Vice President Mike Pence from testifying. Plus, a whole bunch of very sensitive leaked intelligence documents about the war in Ukraine and other hot-button foreign policy crises has left the Pentagon stunned about this leak and looking for answers. We'll tell you what has gone missing. Later in the program, Dominion and Fox News are gearing up to go to trial imminently. We'll talk about what to expect when that starts. All those stories and more when Deadline White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere today.
Hi, I'm Tom Llamas, and for me, the news is so much more than a headline. It informs, it inspires, and it still matters. To cover it, you have to be in it. We'll take you to the front lines of the story, where it's actually happening, with NBC News journalists on the ground from all over the world. We cover what you need to know and bring your newsfeed to life. In primetime and streaming live, it's your news playlist. Join me for Top Story, weeknights at 7 Eastern on NBC News Now.
Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg's investigation into Donald Trump is but one in a sea of many, many, many investigations involving and targeting Trump. This week, Trump will be questioned in the business fraud lawsuit brought by New York's Attorney General Letitia James. And the E. Jean Carroll civil rape trial starts 2 weeks from today. But looming over all of that in Trump world, as we've been discussing, special counsel Jack Smith's twin probes into the classified documents Trump took to Mar-a-Lago and his role in the January 6th insurrection. Just this morning, former senior advisor and speechwriter to Donald Trump, Stephen Miller, reported to U.S. District Court in Washington and was seen entering the area where the grand jury tied to that investigation meets regularly. Now, there are some big clues out there about what information Stephen Miller might be able to provide. For instance, the grand jury will almost certainly want to know what he and Trump talked about the morning of January 6th and how they crafted and then reworked and modified Trump's speech, the one he delivered at the Ellipse that day. Here's what we learned about that process from the January 6th Select Committee.
As you can see from the president's daily diary here, the president spoke to his chief speechwriter, Stephen Miller, for over 25 minutes that morning. Following his call with Mr. Miller, President Trump inserted for the first time a line in his speech that said, quote, "And we will see whether Mike Pence enters history as a truly great and courageous leader. All he has to do is refer the illegally submitted electoral votes back to the states that were given false and fraudulent information where they want to recertify." No prior version of this speech had referenced Vice President Pence or his role during the joint session on January 6th. These last-minute edits by President Trump to his speech were part of the president's pressure campaign against his own vice president.
Pence mention here is timely for today's news cycle. As we speak, Trump is seeking to block Mike Pence, who said he was done fighting. He's done fighting his subpoena. But now Trump is trying to block Pence from testifying in front of the same grand jury. That's according to a source familiar with the litigation involved. A lot of it is secret. But how confident should Trump's team feel, given that just last week a federal appeals court judge denied Trump's effort to block the testimony of several other senior White House aides, including Stephen Miller, which is likely how he ended up before the grand jury today. We're back with Glenn Thrush, Jeremy Bash, and Charlie Sykes. Glenn Thrush, my colleague Katie Tur broadcast in the last hour that Stephen Miller spent 6 hours before this grand jury today. Do you know anything about that?
No, I mean, we've heard the same thing that you alluded to, that it would quite likely involve the revisions of the speech. But, you know, if you know Steve Miller, you know, he can talk for 6 hours straight. That's kind of his thing. But he really is. I think people on the outside don't understand. You know, there've been a lot of people who've moved in and out of Trump world over the years. Miller is really one of the most consistent elements. He is a guy who has just, you know, got himself on Trump's plane in 2016. He used to be an aide to Jeff Sessions. And if you want to talk about someone who is kind of the keeper of the Trump message so far as it exists, he's the coiner of the American carnage line in the inaugural. But so Miller is somebody who has a very, very close relationship with Trump. And a lot of words are exchanged between the two of them. And presumably that's what he testified about.
And I guess, Jeremy Bash, the difference between, I mean, I have the transcripts from his appearance before the January 6th Select Committee. They asked these questions that we showed there, and they got a whole lot of objection, executive privilege, same objection. Is that so the first opportunity to pierce that executive privilege shield would be this grand jury if that is what has happened. But I want to just go back to the 4 crimes that were referred by the Select Committee for Donald Trump: the obstruction of an official proceeding, conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to make a false statement, inciting, assisting, aiding, and comforting an insurrection. The speech on the ellipse and the fake electors plot that was tied to Pence not certifying Joe Biden's victory is the linchpin to all of it. How central do you think Stephen Miller is?
Well, if Mike Pence's role on that January 6th day was to oversee an official proceeding, the counting of the electoral votes before the joint session, then it's pretty clear that Donald Trump obstructed that official proceeding. After all, his people went to the Capitol, stormed it, visited mayhem and violence in an armed assault on that official proceeding, caused Mike Pence to go scurrying into a safe zone protected by the Secret Service. So I think the fact that Stephen Miller inserted into the speech a specific intimidation line directed against Mike Pence is, I think, further evidence, as if any more were needed, that Donald Trump obstructed an official proceeding of the United States. I think that of all the charges that the January 6th committee referred, that's pretty clear cut, Nicolle. I don't think that's much in doubt.
Charlie, I have all this great illustrative sound of Stephen Miller. I cannot bring myself to play it. So let me just describe some of it. He went on Fox and Friends on December 14th, which is an important date in this process. Obviously, it's when the electors meet. But the plot, as he was broadcasting on cable news, was that we've got until the 20th. He says this: the only date in the Constitution is January 20th, so we have more than enough time to right the wrong of this fraudulent election result and certify Trump as the winner of the election. As we speak today, an alternate slate of electors in the contested states is going to vote, and we're going to send those results up to Congress. I mean, he's got a mountain of publicly facing criminal exposure on all 4 of the criminal counts. If Jack Smith decides to create the architecture of a conspiracy, the chief co-conspirator to Donald Trump is Stephen Miller.
Oh, that was exactly the point that I was going to make, that in a conspiracy, you need more than one person. And who is at the center of all this? Who is writing these speeches? So, again, we're speculating here. But, Stephen Miller might not simply have been a witness. He may end up being a target here, because if there was a conspiracy, he was a co-conspirator. He is the Rasputin of the Trump administration. He has been the whisperer. And you can see all the ways in which he was part of this plot to overturn the election, and more specifically, part of the plot to obstruct an official proceeding of the U.S. Congress. So he's right there at the center. So it's very interesting that he would be here at this stage of the investigation and would testify for so long.
Glenn, one of the things that's been under criminal scrutiny by the Justice Department the longest is the fake electors plot. Stephen Miller is talking about it on Fox and Friends. Donald Trump was tweeting out to the state officials and legislators who he needed to flip their votes. It seems that the public-facing evidence of Trump and Stephen Miller's role in that is abundant. Do you have any sense, either in pace or public-facing sort of goings in and out, what the degree of intensity is or heat around Jack Smith's interest in the fake electors plot?
Oh, I think it's intensifying. We've reported, my colleague Danny Hakam colleagues Danny Hakam, Adam Goldman, and myself reported last week that Smith's office appears to be looking at a potential wire fraud, which is email communications between the various quote unquote conspirators over the electors plot, and mail fraud, which would pertain to sending these alternative slates of electors to the National Archives, as well as a conspiracy charge, as well as the obstruction of the official process charge. And we should say, we've reported that last week there was a court ruling, I think it was in Boasberg's court, that ratified the use of extending the obstruction of proceedings statute to cases involving January 6th. So the train definitely seems to be moving quickly in that direction. Whether or not we haven't, I think, reported that Miller is a target, but Miller was clearly in a lot of these meetings communicating with the president directly about this stuff.
Well, if you're talking about wire fraud, there are obviously people on both sides of the wire. Can you say more about that, Glenn Thrush?
I mean, that's sort of what we've been able to ascertain. I mean, the one thing we know from public reporting and stuff that we've done over the months and years is that Trump himself tends to refrain from email and even texting. I think there was some reporting in the last few months that he started texting. It's not something that he's done. So presumably we're talking about individuals, perhaps, who are involved in the folks that have been discussed again in public reporting, like John Eastman, people who were circulating documents. Jeffrey Clark from the Justice Department, who drafted the letter, is somebody who produced paper. So the individuals who were sending around paper and emails with specific elements of the electors plot. But again, Trump is not somebody who has tended to operate in a text or paper space.
Jeremy, as
to say
Glenn,
the least.
Yes. And there are all sorts of reasons I'll refrain from offering any of them up. But if you think about Clark and Meadows and Eastman and Miller being scrutinized as a part of a possible or potential conspiracy to commit the 4 crimes referred by the committee, do all 4 of them, go in there and keep their mouth shut about who directed them to do so? I mean, Trump was directing the whole thing on TV, at rally stages in Georgia, at the events for the Georgia runoff, the phone calls there's so much, again, public-facing evidence of Trump's role in directing the whole thing. What do you make of this picture that Glenn is sort of drawing into sharper focus for us?
Yeah, I think the crimes happen in plain sight. I mean, of course, a careful prosecutor like Jack Smith or another one of his colleagues at the Justice Department is going to go through the process of talking to every relevant witness. So at the end of the day, no one can say that he took a shortcut or that he just mailed it in. On the contrary, he's going to do his diligence. The prosecutor is going to talk to witnesses, review the documents. But the crimes happened in plain sight. It's kind of like the Mar-a-Lago case, which Jack Smith is also looking at with respect to the handling of documents. I mean, look, accidental commingling of classified information happens. I know we're going to talk about the consequences of leaks of classified information in the next segment, Nicole. But this was a case where Donald Trump and his attorneys willfully, purposefully misled the FBI and the Department of Justice about their handling of classified documents, and potentially to grave detriment to national security. And so, when a Jack Smith looks at the conduct, they're looking at state of mind. They're looking at intent. They're looking at what they call in the law mens rea. And the Mar-a-Lago documents case, I think it's pretty clear that there was intent by Donald Trump and his team to mislead federal investigators and to block them from investigating the crime of mishandling classified information.
Yeah, I mean, Charlie, Trump takes his mens rea on every TV appearance he does. He brought it with him on Sean Hannity and said, I just can declassify them by thinking it. We've got in the affidavit all of the intent to keep the documents. And the idea of commingling is an important one, because I think when you've got Pence and Biden with some documents in their libraries, that is a plausible explanation. But there's a 15-month paper trail of specifically what the government wanted back and what they were looking for. We know exactly what was there that shouldn't have been there. And so this was more about lying about what they still had and refusing to return it. It seems to be dripping in intent.
Well, this is what's extraordinary about the scandals of the Trump era. During Watergate, we had these, the secret White House tapes, which revealed the nature of the plot. There's nothing secret about Donald Trump. He is announcing it all in plain sight. This is all in public. He goes on Fox News and he confesses it. He puts it in tweets. I mean, imagine if the things that he has said on Twitter were just now coming out as part of, secret documents that were uncovered by the prosecutors or tapes uncovered by the prosecutors. We would think, oh my God, there's one smoking gun after another. But the smoking guns have been, as Jeremy just mentioned, they have been in plain sight now for months. The question is connecting the dots, buttoning it up, getting all the witnesses in, making sure that we align it with the statutes. But whether you're talking about January 6th or whether you're talking about the Mar-a-Lago documents, most of the central facts are known, are public facing. And this is part of the reality that Donald Trump seems to believe, that if he just comes out and said, yes, I did it, I'm glad I did it, and I will do it again, that somehow that will protect him, and we'll find out whether it works for him again.
Yeah, and I don't say this often on this show, but in his defense, so far it's worked. Glenn Thrush, thank you for pointing us to those pieces of reporting that you guys have done. Really important reporting on Fani Willis and her witnesses, and the federal look at some of the same acts, as well as the latest investigation and latest reporting on Jack Smith's investigation. Glenn and Charlie, thank you for starting us off today. Jeremy sticks around a little bit longer because up next, why the leak of a cache of national security documents are, in the words of one intelligence official, a, quote, nightmare for these United States. That story's next.
Hi, I'm Jen Psaki. I know from the years I've spent on campaign buses, in foreign capitals, and in the Oval Office that there is always more to a story under the surface. On my new show on MSNBC, we're going to bring you inside all of it, breaking down the truth about the things that matter and visiting with some of the most fascinating people in the news today. So I hope you join me every Sunday at noon Eastern on MSNBC for Inside with Jen Psaki.
At this point, do you believe the leak is contained? Are there more documents out there that have not been released publicly? Is this an ongoing threat?
We don't know. We truly don't.
We don't know. That was National Security Council spokesman John Kirby on the stunning and still rather mysterious leak of a huge batch of classified documents. Now, here's what happened. Late last week, intelligence officials announced or revealed that more than 100 documents leaked online on various social media sites, revealing in detail American national security secrets on everything from Ukraine to the Middle East to China. From the New York Times reporting on this, quote, the scale of the leak could be hugely damaging, with one senior intelligence official calling the leak, quote, a nightmare for the Five Eyes, in a reference to the U.S., Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, the so-called Five Eyes nations that broadly share intelligence. While both the Pentagon and the Justice Department are investigating the source of the leaks, trying to figure out who was behind them, officials are still, as you saw there, assessing the damage from exactly what documents have leaked. Perhaps the most alarming revelation that we know about so far. One of the documents released just in late February gives a grim assessment of the situation in Ukraine. Once again, from the Times reporting on this, quote, for more than a year, Ukrainian air defenses, reinforced by Western weaponry, have kept Russian planes at bay. But without a huge influx of munitions, Ukraine's entire air defense network, weakened by repeated barrages from Russian drones and missiles, could fracture, potentially allowing Vladimir Putin of Russia to unleash his lethal fighter jets in ways that could change the course of the war. Joining us now, New York Times Pentagon correspondent Helene Cooper has been on this story since it broke, and Jeremy Bash is still with us. Helene, I know you've written now a bunch of stories about this. Take us through your reporting.
Hi, Nicolle. It's nice to see you. Hi, Jeremy.
You too.
This broke on Thursday when we got we heard from a couple of analyst who just sent us a picture of a Telegram, Telegram, the social website post going, have you seen this? And we looked at it, and there were at that point only 4 documents, but they all had the top secret joint staff top secret label on there, and they looked legitimate. We then went to the Pentagon and to the administration and the White House, and they immediately started asking us not to publish, which is the first sign that these are legitimate documents. They started asking us not to publish, and we started looking into it. They didn't want us to publish the actual documents, the slides of the documents, because they were worried about revealing sources and methods. So the first story we did on this does not have photos of the slides, even though the argument we made was this is already on Telegram. And it turns out it was on Twitter as well. By Friday, they had dumped 107 more documents, which was an astounding number. Posted onto these websites that came from the site Discord, sort of a gaming site that your teenagers in the house used to go into chat rooms and stuff like that. And the scale of the leak as we trickled into the weekend became more widely known, and this was kind of mind-boggling. There are 2 different, some of the documents that have been put up are joint staff from the Office of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the directorate there, where they disperse in emails widely to hundreds, if not thousands of people, these daily updates that are sort of American intel assessments of what's going on around the world, but particularly in Ukraine. But then some of the documents that have been leaked are from the CIA, and they're draft documents that only go out to a few people, few meaning maybe 100, or it could be few meaning, dozen. But so what we've seen is sort of the kind of a straw view of the American assessment as of March 1st of primarily what's going on in Ukraine from a variety of agencies, a variety of intelligence agencies that put together these assessments and these drafts for American officials to sort of, it's not exactly the PDB, but it's a version of the presidential, is another version of the presidential daily brief. So it gives you very much how Americans see the war. But the big thing that jumped out at me about this is just how deeply, deeply compromised the Russian military is. It showed just how many holes, just how accurate the American intel on Russia is, how compromised the Russian military is, and just how many different ways we have into the Russian military. And it's kind of ironic that it took an American intel breach to sort of tell us and tell Russia just how deep we are, how deep our intel agencies are into their apparatus.
I mean, say more about the substance. I have a million questions about how this could happen and what they're doing to try to sort of figure out if they know everything that's out there. It seems like that could be a very involved process, but I don't want to get distracted from the substance. Tell me more of the substance of what's in these documents.
It's so funny that you asked them, because I've been struggling with the substance versus the actual leak itself, and that's a tough balance to
the
draw.
leak is like an irresistible story, right? But I feel like what you're saying as a journalist is like we have this glimpse into something, and even if they don't want us to see it, it's on these gaming sites. Let's responsibly dig into what we're learning.
The substance is that this is a war that's going horribly for Russia, according to American intelligence assessments. But it's not going that well for Ukraine either. The substance is that, for instance, on the Ukraine front, Ukraine was on March 1st. And again, we have to keep remembering that this leak is a straw view. This is the American intelligence assessment as of March 1st. On March 1st, American agencies believed that the Ukrainian, for instance, expenditure rate for their air defense systems were fast, that they were going through stuff too quickly, and that they were in danger of using up their air defenses, which are what basically has kept the Russian Air Force out of this war. Vladimir Putin has not sent in his fighter jets and his MiGs and his bombers because he's afraid they're going to get shot out of the sky, taken down, because the Ukrainian air defenses have been performing so well, but they're, as of March 1st, they were running very low and they were shooting things down. They were shooting things down they were using too many munitions to shoot down things. And there was a worry that Russia was sending so many strikes and attacks into Ukraine as a way to get them to deplete their air defense. So you've seen the West, you've seen NATO, and you've seen the United States really ramp up air defense munitions to Ukraine. President Biden just last week announced another $2.6 billion package, and a lot of that was air defenses. So that was one snapshot. Another snapshot that you saw is sort of there were a lot of different windows into the Wagner Group, and the Wagner Group, for instance, going to Turkey and trying to get them to help them with weaponry for both Ukraine and for Mali. There's so many different things in there. There was stuff in there about South Korea and their secret ammunition shipments to Ukraine. There's a huge, but one of the things that I thought was striking in this is just all of the information we had about when Russia was about to strike. We knew Russia was launching a strike at Ukraine at about, sometimes even before they launched it. And we certainly have been telling Ukraine, in real time, they call this real-time battlefield intelligence, is basically, look, they're coming over the berm, or look, they're about to hit in about 13 minutes a Russian, there's going to be a Russian airstrike at so-and-so place. That's hugely helpful for Ukraine, for them to get these air defenses going to protect themselves from it. But that also shows that we have ways into the Russian military apparatus, the GRU, all the different, Russian military units that, if I were the Kremlin, I would be very, very concerned that the United States is so deep into this Russian military apparatus.
Jeremy Bash.
A couple of thoughts, Nicolle. First, Helene, thanks for that great reporting. I don't think we know enough, Nicolle, at this hour to say who leaked it, whether it was leaked purposely or hacked, why the person did what they did, what their motivation was, and how they accomplished this. I don't know if we know at this hour whether all of these documents are real or whether some of them are doctored. I just don't think we know enough about the damage assessment that will undoubtedly be unfolding at the Pentagon within the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. I have to say, I think it's important and imperative that the Pentagon and other agencies keep close tabs on social media and the deep and dark web, because if there's a leak like this, a horrendous leak like this, it turns out it's going to show up there first. And so that early indication and warning is going to come from, of all places, open sources. Now, I think in terms of the substance, Helene hit on some of a couple of the points. I also think one of the challenges is the collection that we've done against our allies and partners. We should talk about that more, because that's what I think ultimately is most difficult for U.S. officials to explain.
Right, and that's what sort of bleeds into a diplomatic crisis, right? Not necessarily military or intelligence. There's so much more to this story. I would like both of you to please come back, keep your schedules free in the 4 p.m. hour to continue this conversation. Helene Cooper, Jeremy Bash, thank you so much. We have to take a quick break. There's so much more ahead. Don't go anywhere. Since we've been on the air, President Joe Biden has landed in Belfast, Northern Ireland. He is there to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, which, of course, ended 3 decades of violence known as the Troubles, but now finds itself under threat in the wake of Brexit. President Biden will deliver a speech tomorrow in Belfast, urging all parties to keep the peace. He'll then be spending 3 days in his ancestral homeland, the Republic of Ireland. We'll be covering that. The next hour of Deadline White House starts after a quick break. Don't go anywhere. Hi again, everyone. It's 5 o'clock in New York now, and we are following breaking news on that monster $1.6 billion with a B defamation lawsuit against Fox News. It is expected to get underway in 6 days. We are officially in the pretrial home stretch, if that's a thing, legally. Jury selection starts in less than 48 hours. Shortly before we came on the air, one of the last pretrial hearings wrapped up with some fiery moments in court. Jeremy Peters of the New York Times was inside the courtroom today. He'll join us in a minute. He writes this, quote, "The judge ruled that Fox News could not argue that it broadcast false information about Dominion voting systems on the basis that the allegations were newsworthy, limiting a key line of defense for the network as it faces the beginning of a potentially costly defamation trial next week." Quote, "The judge also ruled that Dominion could not reference the January 6, 2021 assault on the Capitol, except in very narrow circumstances, saying that he did not want jurors to be prejudiced by events that weren't relevant to the central question in the case. Did Fox air wild claims about Dominion's purported involvement in a conspiracy to steal the 2020 presidential election from Donald Trump, knowing that they were lies?" Judge Davis said he would allow lawyers to ask potential jurors about their cable news viewing habits and whether they watched Fox News programs or intentionally avoided them. He will not, however, permit questions about how someone voted. And that is just the tip of the iceberg from today's pretrial hearing. Buckle up. It's where we start the hour with some of our favorite reporters and friends. University of Utah law professor Rennell Anderson-Jones is with us. Joining us by phone is New York Times reporter Jeremy Peters. That was all of his great reporting that we just read from. He was inside today's hearing. With me at the table for the hour, Boston Globe senior columnist and co-host of the #Sisters-in-Law podcast, Kim Atkins-Storr. She's also an MSNBC contributor. Jeremy, take us inside what happened today.
So I just left the courtroom, Nicolle, where Judge Eric Davis in Delaware Superior Court handed Fox a pretty significant legal setback, though it wasn't all bad news for them today. The big headline for Fox that was not good for them is that the judge has effectively told them, you can't tell the jury that these allegations were newsworthy and therefore that's why you covered them. He said that's irrelevant. And this is significant because for months, Fox lawyers have argued in court, in their filings, in interviews with me, that the reason they gave people like Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani a platform is they were making inherently newsworthy statements. And there was nothing more newsworthy at the time than the president of the United States claiming that the election wasn't free and fair. Well, a judge said, you can't tell the jury that because those statements were false. That's all that matters. He told Fox that it matters only that they were the broadcaster of these statements. They gave Sidney Powell a platform to lie, and that's all that matters as a matter of law. As you point out, the judge did limit how Dominion is going to be able to make his case. Today, he also ruled that Dominion is not going to be able to talk about January 6th, except in very, very limited ways. And Dominion wanted to be able to use this issue of January 6th as a way, not to say that Fox caused January 6th, but as a way to show that Fox had pivoted its coverage around President Trump and it knew, its hosts knew, and were privately disgusted by many of the president's actions. So, a mixed day of decisions, but certainly the judge, all in all, was tougher on Fox than he was on Dominion, and at one point actually admonished lawyers for Fox for withholding information about Rupert Murdoch's involvement in Fox News that made it seem like he had a far less significant role in managing the network. The judge said at one point to a Fox lawyer, look, I have to be able to trust that when you talk to me, I know that what you're saying is true. And what you said wasn't in fact true.
What is the status of whether Rupert Murdoch will testify in this trial?
Oh, he will. The judge has said that that Dominion can compel both Murdochs to testify, and also they can compel Suzanne Scott the chief executive of Fox News to testify as well. So I think that's something that we are, all but are virtually guaranteed to see happen. And it will be, as you know, an incredibly compelling and dramatic moment.
I understand that the topic of death threats against Fox News has come up, and that Fox wanted to block Dominion from mentioning some of the more dramatic kind of personal anecdotal testimony we've heard from the head of Dominion, that the death threats and the harassment of their employees has been rampant since the election claims permeated Fox News and the Republican right. The judge said no, that those would be allowed. What's the significance of that, Jeremy?
Well, that's right, because what Dominion has done as part of making its case and a major reason for the whopping $1.6 billion ask in damages is that its employees received death threats. People recently have even shown up outside of the Dominion headquarters in Denver carrying guns. People left voicemail messages threatening to blow up the Dominion offices. And Dominion wanted to be able to use some of that in its arguments before the jury. But what the judge said is, okay, Dominion, you can talk about the threats that you've received, but it has to be in very general and vague terms. You can't get into the specifics of those threats. You can't say that somebody left a message saying they wanted to blow up the headquarters because Fox shouldn't be held responsible for the actions of a third party, like a crazy person who calls and issues a death threat.
Jeremy, having watched this pre-trial period as closely as just about anyone, what is your impression as we head into the final news cycles or days, or I guess in the eyes of Fox and Dominion, these are their final legal cycles ahead of a trial?
Exactly. So Fox is really back on its heels much more so than it already was. The judge has significantly limited its avenues for mounting the kind of legal defense it wanted. First there was that decision earlier this month, from the judge saying that basically half of what Dominion had asked for, he was granting them. And he was only leaving one issue for the jury to decide. And that was the issue of whether or not Fox acted with actual malice, meaning that it knew it was putting lies on the air. So anyway, really Dominion has a much, much smaller job to do now. Then you had the hearing today that really limits what Fox is going to be allowed to tell a jury. And I think that if I were looking at this on a scorecard, I would say that going into the trial that starts on Monday, Dominion is definitely up a few points.
And Jeremy, you said that Rupert and Lachlan Murdoch will testify, Suzanne Scott will testify, Paul Ryan, who sits on the board of Fox Corp, will testify, Viet Din, former Justice Department official, now the Fox Corp's chief legal officer, will testify. Did Dominion lose? Is everyone that Dominion wanted to testify going to testify?
All of the big names, not every single one. The judge didn't grant them every single ask, but he did give them the big names. And those are the ones that you just mentioned. You are also going to see hosts like Hannity and Jeanine Pirro and Tucker Carlson called to the witness stand. And those, I don't need to tell you, will be equally just as compelling.
Jeremy, there's some reporters who've been tweeting about this that have talked about the judge's disposition or potentially the impression that the judge was exasperated by Fox, perhaps particularly around questions about Rupert Murdoch's testimony. Was that something you witnessed, and is that anything you can tell us about?
Absolutely. No, it was very clear that the judge hit the limits of his patience with Fox lawyers at several times. At one point, he admonished them about how he would interrupt them and tell the jury to disregard Fox lawyers if they pursued a certain line of argument. He was very firm about that and very stern. And in the incident you just referenced, Fox only recently disclosed in the last 48 hours that Rupert Murdoch is legally an officer of Fox News. Now, that means that he has more legal exposure, that he can be called as a witness, and that Dominion should have received more from his personal communications than they have already. The judge said, look, this is a really big deal. You can't hide the involvement of the chairman of the company and say he's one thing when he's not, say that he has a much smaller role, he's not really involved. Well, now Fox is admitting that, in fact, Rupert Murdoch is more involved than they let on, and the judge was not happy about that. He made that very clear.
It's an unbelievable day of fireworks at a really crucial point in this whole process ahead of the trial, 6 days ahead of the trial. Jeremy Peters, I know you've had a really long day. We're grateful to grab 12 minutes with you between your being in that courtroom and covering it and everything else that you have to do today. So thank you very much for making that time for us. I want to bring Ronelle Anderson and Kim Eckenstor into this. I mean, Kim, I'm tempted to put sort of a political frame around this about the losing, but this feels bigger than that. I mean, these are serious legal equities. And to have a judge so angry, I mean, Jeremy just said he was hiding the involvement of Rupert Murdoch in the dealings at Fox News. That sounds like a big and hugely important setback.
Yes, it does. And it also seems that Judge Davis is being very, very clear and careful here in making sure that what goes before the jury, once it's impaneled, is what is most salient to this case. He's keeping the sensationalism out on both sides, both in the ruling, limiting what Dominion can say about January 6th, as well as the limits on Fox News, but clearly making it very, very concrete that saying, hey, I'm a news organization, this is our job to air all this stuff, that is not a defense in the face of what he's already found as a matter of law to be false, defamatory information that was broadcast repeatedly on Fox News. There's only so many defenses to that, and what Fox News continues to try to throw at the wall, he's not allowing to stick.
And Ronelle, I mean, we try to track this as it emerges publicly. And to my recollection, Fox has been deprived of a defense of saying, oh, it was newsworthy, the president was saying it. Fox has also been deprived of the ability to say we didn't know it was false because of the thousands of communications between Dominion and Fox and acknowledged receipt of said communications. Tell me what the questions will be before the jury.
Well, the winnowing of these pretrial motions means that the checklist that Dominion had to tick off in order to win has a number of boxes already ticked. What remains on the list to be argued before the jury are really two things. One is the question of knowing falsity. As you noted, falsity itself has already been decided. So the jury won't hear arguments about whether what was said about Dominion was true or false. We start from the position that it was false. But the question of knowing falsity, and particularly knowing falsity throughout the organization, the connecting of the dots between who knew that it was false and who was responsible for the creation of the content and the broadcast of the content. And that's those are the two things, the knowing falsity question and the connecting of those dots within the corporate structure about who's responsible for the creation. And the arguments are going to be shaped around those two things and nothing else. What we see in these pretrial motions is this judge really leaning on the parties to emphasize to them that things that have already been resolved may not make their way in through a back door or resurrect themselves in front of juries. So this judge has already handled the question of falsity. Any suggestion that this wasn't false is not going to go before the jury. This judge has already handled some of those key defenses that Fox attempted, having to do with neutral reporting or fair reporting privilege. And because those have already been rejected, the judge is very sensitive to the question of lines of questioning and lines of evidence that might try to reference those. And he's made clear here today that if he starts to see that sort of thing happening, he will interrupt and emphasize to the jury himself that Fox can't argue those things.
Just if you step back and try to process in the context of our politics the statement that falsity has been decided, it's off the table. I mean, paging Mar-a-Lago, we still have a giant chunk of the country for whom falsity has not been decided.
Yeah, and I think that's one important part of this case. I think that I'm not a part of Dominion's legal team, but that's one reason that I guess that they did not entertain any settlement offers, which I'm sure Fox News put forward. They want to say in a very clear public way, this is false. We have our day in court, and we're going to take our day in court to prove not only were these false things that were said, but that there is evidence that it was either done at the very least recklessly, but more likely knowingly, that actual malice standard that they need to prove to win this case. But that is also crucial to determine the amount of damages that they can get. They're suing for over $1 billion, but they could also get punitive damages if it is found that everyone in Fox, all the salient people, the witnesses that you talked about, if they knew this to be false and they continue to put that out there, that can leave Fox open to a very large punitive damages award as well that would serve a purpose to say, look, news organizations cannot get away from doing this. They cannot use this news privilege to knowingly put forward something that is this damaging to an organization.
Renelle, haven't we already seen a lot of that evidence? Rupert saying, Sean's getting mad. We're going to have all three of them come out and walk back the lies. All of Tucker's tweets and emails with his producer back and forth about how crazy and nutso Sidney Powell is. I mean, haven't we seen a lot of the evidence that shows that they knew damn well that these were lies, that they broadcast them? In some cases, they rebroadcast them. And we know the motive as well. I mean, the smoking gun evidence that ratings were driving everything has been presented in communication after communication after communication.
Yes, Dominion previewed in many respects what we will see at trial in the motion for summary judgment, which was, I think all scholars and commentators in this space agree, quite remarkable and quite rare. It's rare in one of these cases that requires a showing of knowing falsity to have a body of evidence that includes internal communication saying things like, this is a lie, this is ludicrous, this is crazy. The key pieces that are going to remain are the question of connecting that material to the actual decision to create this content about this company. It isn't enough for purposes of this suit to show that Fox News had an awareness generally that the election wasn't stolen or that it leaned into election denialism as a coverage decision. It has to be the case that these particular statements about this particular plaintiff were knowing lies or were told with reckless disregard for the truth. And that's the task that lies ahead in the trial that starts next week.
And that's where the thousands of communications from Dominion directly to talent and producers and board members and others at Fox comes into play, that they don't deny receipt of those.
That's right. That's right. We should note, as we've talked about on this program before, the key witness may well turn out to be a producer from one of those shows who has now launched a suit of her own against Fox News, who may connect some of those dots. She may be the person who indicates the relationship between the wider corporate structure and some of the decisions that were made at the show level in ways that are really critical to Dominion's claim.
Just an unbelievable sort of development 6 days out from the trial. Renelle Anderson-Jones, thank you so much for making sense of it for us. Kim sticks around. When we come back, the perilous political waters Republicans now find themselves in thanks to Republicans and their hard-right lurch on hot-button issues, things like abortion access and guns. Plus, calls are growing for an ethics investigation into Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. That's after new reporting and revelations that he took very fancy vacations with a billionaire Republican donor. One of the Democrats on the Senate Judiciary Committee will be our guest. She's demanding action. Later in the hour, one of the expelled Tennessee state lawmakers is back on the job. The other could join him as soon as tomorrow. And both return to that body as national figures. How the latest anti-democracy move by Republicans backfired big time. Deadline White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
Hi, I'm Jen Psaki. I know from the years I've spent on campaign buses, in foreign capitals, and in the Oval Office that there is always more to a story under the surface. On my new show on MSNBC, we're going to bring you inside all of it, breaking down the truth about the things that matter and visiting with some of the most fascinating people in the news today. So I hope you join me every Sunday at noon Eastern on MSNBC for Inside with Jen Psaki.
Why over the last few years have we seen this really rise quickly? And I think it's because the right wing is now understanding that time is not on their side, that this new generation of voters, young millennials and Gen Z, are overwhelmingly voting for Democratic candidates who actually care about their future, a future where there's no gun violence, a future where we work to prevent the climate crisis and work on the issues of our time.
A very inconvenient truth for Republicans. The newest generation of voters, they know exactly what they want, and it is not what the GOP has offered up. Instead of trying to broaden their appeal or their coalition, today's Republican Party is firmly entrenched in the delusions of its extremist fringe base, fanning the flames of the culture wars, enacting unbelievably punitive and unsafe bans on abortion and reproductive health care, and refusing to do and saying out loud that there's nothing they can or will do about the raging epidemic of gun violence that is plaguing every community in our country. As a political strategy, we know it's bombing based on new reporting in the New York Times. Quote, some Republicans are warning that the uncompromising position of their party's activist base could be leading them over an electoral cliff next year. When it comes to abortion, there are ongoing Republican efforts to enact extremely strict bans, ones that eliminate all of the exceptions. Like in Florida, where a 6-week ban already passed the state Senate. The House is zooming through the House. They could vote on it this week. Meanwhile, the liberal candidate in last week's Wisconsin state Supreme Court election campaigned heavily on abortion health care, and she won in Wisconsin by 11 points. That loss for the GOP was described by the editorial board for one large paper as a 5-alarm warning for the GOP. The board wrote this, quote, Republicans had better get their abortion position straight and more in line with where voters are, or they will face another disappointment in 24. A total ban is a loser in swing states. Republicans who insist on that position could soon find that electoral defeats will lead to even more liberal state abortion laws than under Roe. Guess where that warning came from? The conservative publication, The Wall Street Journal. Can't make this up anymore, guys. Joining our coverage, Eddie Glaude, chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University and an MSNBC contributor. Also joining us, political strategist and MSNBC contributor Matt Dowd. Kim Atkins-Storr is with me here on set. Matt Dowd, this story sort of writes itself, right? But it's already etched in stone. Republicans are already for this. Republicans made this happen. Republicans pushed through the 6 conservative justices who already sit on the Supreme Court. And as their popularity and trust and integrity in the eyes of the American people plunges, the Republicans are tied to them. So too do they.
Yeah, and I think your setup piece is a very accurate portrayal about the circumstances that are faced in coming in the future electoral cycles. I think we have to be careful. I think we have to be careful that all of us know, and the polls say it, that all the positions on these issues that Republicans have are completely out of step with the majority of the country, completely out of step with the majority of country. But we have a structure in our country that doesn't always reveal and doesn't always implement what the majority of the country wants. And that's through a combination of gerrymandering and sorting and geographic distribution and all those other things that are in the course of this. But in the sort of short term, can the Republicans survive in the short term? They could probably survive. And that's my fear, is they win a few races and they still continue to think this is okay. In the long term, as we embrace and are more in the middle of a multicultural democracy where the views of the younger voters are actually what the views of everyone are, they can't survive. But my thinking is Republicans know this. They have to know this, but they're willing to sort of sacrifice the long term for any short term gain they can get on an ideological position.
Kim, 93% of all Americans oppose abortion bans that eliminate the exception for life of mother. 85% of all Americans oppose abortion bans that eliminate the exceptions for rape and incest. Republicans are so far beyond that, they are now looking at criminalizing abortion in some southern states. And it's, again, it's already happened. And I'm just struck by the fact that Republicans need, and it's not just Democrats, it's independents, and it's a lot of Republicans, to look at these issues disaggregated, right? They need women to look at abortion as one issue. They need young people and moms to look at guns as a separate issue. And they need democracy to be the concerns of the elite. But what has happened, and you can't manufacture this in an ad lab, what has happened is that events have revealed that they are all one story.
Yes, and what is also happening is that these are things that touch people. I think Republicans had victories with culture wars and things like, the Muslim ban, as xenophobic as that was, and pushing back against Black Lives Matter and other things that could gin up the base, but it was personally removed from most of the voters. I think most people understand what mifepristone is because they've either had someone in their lives or they themselves have suffered a miscarriage or was assaulted or something else and needed this care. And the idea that it will no longer be available. Keep in mind, it's only FDA approved up to 10 weeks. We're talking about early first trimester here. The same thing
23 years of approval. Right. It's been used for 23 years.
So this is something that people understand and touch when they see their students on lockdowns in college, and they're saying, oh, this is the second or third time I've experienced this since elementary school. They understand and they feel that. So waging the culture, or when it comes to anti-trans attacks and things like that, they understand, especially young people, know people in the LGBTQ community, and they're not frightening to them. So it pushes this strategy that worked. Donald Trump got more votes in 2020 than he did in 2016, almost 10 million more. But it's reaching its limit when it's reaching into places, and in order to appease white evangelical base here, this state there, these very extreme portions of the base in other places, trying to pull that together is really running a risk of pulling apart the other parts of the electorate that they will need, and energizing Democrats to vote against the people who support these policies in a way that could be really perilous at the next election.
Yeah, Eddie, Kim's making a great point about people's lives touch these extreme policies. They're not abstract. I saw a story today that 1 in 5 Americans has been touched by or knows someone impacted by gun violence in the country. It's not disconnected from the conversation we had yesterday, that we continue to assemble to talk about things in the news, and the conversation continues to be replaced by coming on the air and having to cover another mass shooting in America.
Yeah. And I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday in relation to this one.
Me too.
And one of the things that I think Kim and Matt are right about what they're saying, but I think we have to think about this outside of election victories and understand that there are people in the country, particularly in the Republican Party, who are acting in light of what they perceive as an existential threat to the country. And so what we're seeing over and over again, Nicolle, is a relitigation of the 1960s. And what do I mean? There's an assault on voting rights. That's an assault on the Black freedom movement. There's an assault on women's rights. That's an assault on the women's liberation movement. There's an assault on the gay liberation movement with the assault on trans and Don't Say Gay movement. So we see among the Republican Party a relitigation of that period in U.S. history. Because I think those folk believe that the country that they feel a sense of possession of is being lost. And so it's right for us to read it in terms of electoral politics, but we have to understand, I think, the underlying sense of what's motivating the base. And that is what they perceive to be the fight over the soul of the nation.
I want to read one thing. I want to give the last word in this conversation. No one's going anywhere, but to Molly Jong Fast, who writes this. Republicans have run into a ditch. Their base gets high off displays of authoritarianism and religious zealotry. So they've taken up an agenda that actively targets fellow Americans, inflicting real harm on communities with race-baiting tactics and onerous health restrictions. After touching the third rail of the Republican base and narrowly eking out a win in 2016, Republicans found themselves dependent on that base for turnout. Now they have gone so far down this road that they find themselves staring down an intractable death ray with crushing defeat, unless, that is, they change the rules and keep minority rule. Sort of ties together everything all of you said. All right, I need you guys to stick around a little bit longer because when we come back, new pressure is being applied by Senate Democrats to crack down on a blossoming ethical scandal surrounding the United States Supreme Court. That's next.
This is Nicolle Wallace from MSNBC. Donald Trump became the first ex-president to be arraigned on criminal charges, pleading not guilty to 34 felonies. On MSNBC's new podcast, Prosecuting Donald Trump, legal analysts and veteran prosecutors Andrew Weissman and Mary McCord break down how Alvin Bragg, Fani Willis, and Jack Smith might think about building a case when the defendant happens to be an ex-president. Search for Prosecuting Donald Trump wherever you're listening and follow.
And new reporting reveals that over many decades, Clarence Thomas has secretly accepted luxury trips from a major GOP donor. Thomas insists these gifts from Crow don't count because of their personal relationship, saying, "We have been friends for over 25 years. Okay, but you've been on the Supreme Court for 31 years. Oh, it's not a bribe. He's my friend. Oh, how'd you guys meet? He was bribing me." Yeah.
Stephen Colbert homing in there on the ridiculousness of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas's attempts to defend or explain away and conceal, really, 20 years of refusing to abide by the few rules that do exist, disclosing luxury gifts from Republican megadonor Harlan Crow. Ever since ProPublica reported on Clarence Thomas's failure to disclose accepting tens of thousands of dollars in gifts and travel over decades, there have been renewed calls for investigating Clarence Thomas and for implementing stricter ethical rules for the justices who sit on the Supreme Court. Today, Democratic members of the Senate Judiciary Committee sent a letter to Chief Justice John Roberts, urging him to investigate Thomas's behavior, writing this, quote, "If the court does not resolve this issue on its own, the committee will consider legislation to resolve it. But you do not need to wait for Congress to act to undertake your own investigation into the reported conduct and to ensure that it cannot happen again. We urge you to do so." Joining our conversation, Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota. She is a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Thank you so much for taking time to talk to us.
Thanks, Nicolle. It's great to be on.
So what are you going to do? What is Congress going to do? What's the Senate going to do?
Okay. Number one, a number of us have been pushing this for a long time. They need ethical rules of conduct. I'm glad that the Judicial Conference clarified that they have to report some of this stuff now. But you think about the fact that decades ago, Clarence Thomas reported tires as gifts and a Bible as a gift, the Bible from the same person. And then suddenly he's on yacht trips and they're not being reported. We have a breakdown of trust right now with the U.S. Supreme Court, and they should want to change that. And so our first ask is of Chief Justice Roberts saying, put in place these rules. But guess what? Meanwhile, while you're debating that, We are going to have hearings on this, so expect that to come soon, Nicolle, on the Senate Judiciary Committee. And we have a bill already led by Chris Murphy that a number of us are on that basically puts forth a set of ethical rules. They should have the same set of ethical rules that other judges abide by.
Will you call Thomas and Crow?
As witnesses, I'm not going to reveal what we're exactly doing as witnesses till it goes public. But clearly, Senator Durbin, the chair, will make those decisions. But I think that we need to have a thorough hearing to get to the bottom of what went on here and how this went down, as well as what the solution is. I have already called on the court to get ethical rules in place after we found out that Clarence Thomas also did not recuse himself from insurrection cases, despite his wife's involvement. And that's what really bothers me. He once recused himself from a decision on a case involving a school where his son went, and now he didn't recuse himself from this. All of this cries out not just for the rules, but also cries out for having an enforcement mechanism, someone to investigate them as they do with the other federal judges. Again, I'm all about that this court has to have the same ethics rules that everyone else does.
The letter makes it sound like the Senate Judiciary Committee could live with Roberts doing this on his own. Is that on the table, or are you prepared to legislate a solution?
Well, I'm on the bill, so obviously if I could wave a magic wand, I would put forth a bill and get that bill passed, right? That the bill we have now, we should pass it. But in the meantime, what we're pushing for is him to put the rules in himself and get the court to sign on. They all have an interest in this. It isn't just one judge.
I mean, I guess I asked because Justice Alito said that the leak of the Dobbs decision risks the assassination of the court's conservative justices, and they weren't interested in an actual leak investigation. They used their internal security to investigate. I mean, do you think that they are actually interested in being held to any of the same standards that you are as a member of Congress?
By the way, one other thing I'd add to that is televised hearings so that we can actually see when they're debating things. So an elite group just doesn't get to go in and watch. I don't think that's fair either. And that's something Senator Grassley and I have
cameras
called for.
in the
so
Supreme Court.
I think that we should change cameras in the Supreme Court. I think that we should change these rules. Now, I want you to picture us enacting this. First of all, we have to get the House to agree.
Yeah.
Go for that, Nicolle. And then we have to pass that, and then, of course, they would decide whether or not it's constitutional. So all that being said, this is time for them to act. And I think the hearings will shed a lot of light on this. I'm looking forward to that.
I mean, the other reality is the political reality, right? The Supreme Court is now a drag on the right, being associated with them, creating them. The Trump Supreme Court, his picks, are now have resulted in the most unpopular United States Supreme Court in American history. A piece of that is its decision to overturn Roe versus Wade. What do you make of the analysis that all of these extreme positions are a real political dead weight for the Republican Party?
I really enjoyed your last discussion because as more and more young people are able to vote, as they get turning that magic age, you're seeing a shift. And I think it is a drag. This is not where they are. And once they lost that presidential election in states like, as you know, and then some of this continued in the midterms in states like Arizona and states like Nevada and Georgia, instead of changing their candidates and changing their policies and putting forth and agreeing with us on some of these great judges that we've put forward, what do? They double down and try to change their voters with voter suppression laws. That's my problem. And certainly this latest decision on the district court level with this one judge in Amarillo is going to give them an opportunity, let's call it an opportunity, to actually make clear what the law is, which is that this decision is basically crazy and absurd and out of line with precedent for any drug.
Your former colleague, Senator Claire McCaskill, yesterday expressed some exasperation with the pace of confirming President Joe Biden's appointees. Is there anything you can say about that?
I would change the rules on this. I've made this very clear. I would actually speed up the time it takes for the non-cabinet positions, and I would put it in place for whoever the president is. We have literally half of the positions in the government, roughly, are still open. That is crazy. He has put forward people for a number of these positions, and they sit. And I would just change the rules, take them out of congressional confirmation, not the cabinet members, not the judges, but not the deputies, but so many people await Senate confirmation. Senators don't like to give up that ability to hold that over an administrator's heads. Well, if you have that ability, then you better be reasonable about it. And I'm just tired of this because I think it makes it very difficult for a president to do their job. So I share her frustration.
We should have a longer conversation. We'll bring her back and have a longer, because I think people have no idea how hamstrung any administration is by this process. It's pretty opaque.
And some of the positions that have been left open, Nicolle,
right.
And I think that would be great because, you know, Claire and I are friends. I would love to do that.
I think the two of you could solve just about anything. Senator Amy Klobuchar, thank you for spending some time with us on all this. We are grateful.
It was great to be on. Thanks.
When we come back, State Representative Justin Jones is now back in the Tennessee State House. Former Representative Justin Pearson is on his way back. The third member of the Tennessee Three will be our guest after a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
I want to thank you all, not for what you did, but for awakening the people of this state, particularly the young people. Thank you for reminding us that the struggle for justice is fought and won in every generation.
Wow, that was Tennessee State Representative, again, Justin Jones, returning to the House floor last night, thanking that chamber, that majority white, majority Republican state legislature for what has become a international story and a national outrage and attention over his expulsion just 4 days ago. Jones and former Representative Justin Pearson, both Democrats, both black, were expelled after leading chants for state gun safety legislation, days after yet another deadly mass shooting, this one at a school just a few miles away. As we watched live here yesterday, the 36-member Nashville Metropolitan Council voted unanimously to reinstate Jones. And less than an hour later, our next guest, State Representative Gloria Johnson, who survived her own expulsion vote last week, escorted Jones back onto the State House floor, a moment she described as, quote, justice. State Representative Gloria Johnson is back with us now. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
We were captivated by your fight. You survived the vote, but all the same, they voted to expel you. Do you think the body, the people actually in it who voted to expel Representative Pearson and Jones, is changed in any way?
You know, I don't know. I would like to think that that's something that's going to happen, that maybe they will think about the situation, think about what they did, what it looked like, what it was, quite frankly, because we have had worse behavior on the floor and we're likely to have more bad behavior in some respects, you know, just based on what has come before, where absolutely no one was punished at all. And so in this instance, where they tried to expel 3 members for breaking a single house rule, and, you know, the majority of the time we were in front of the body, it was during a recess. So it was something way out of the ordinary. I hope that my Republican colleagues will think about that issue, think about what it looked like to America, because it was not a good look. And the people spoke loudly and clearly. And thank goodness for these young people who continue to come every day. They're so organized. They're so smart. They are not going to let this issue go away. And we need young voices like Representative Jones and Representative Pearson to lift those voices. And they are desperately needed in the Tennessee House right now.
You used your voice to say that the reason you survived and they didn't in the moment was because of race. Do you think the body is at all chastened, could behave in a way that is any less racist on the other side of this?
You know, sometimes when you say something is racist, people think, well, I'm not racist. But I hope they think. I hope they listen to the questions that they asked. I hope they listen to the tone that they used and kind of understand that racism is it was, that tone was very, very clear in the questions to my younger colleagues. It was demeaning to me, but it was a different tone still yet and tinged with racism. And that was very clear. And I know sometimes people don't like to think of themselves of being racist, but, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to wear a white hood.
Powerful words from you every step of the way. What will it feel like for the three of you to be reunited in the chamber once Representative Pearson is reinstated, as he's expected to be?
Yeah, I'll be going to Memphis tomorrow to see there and be there for that vote. And it's really, like I said, it's so critical and so important to this body that we have those young voices, these very smart men who really understand the issues. They're passionate about the issues, and they're passionate about their community, and they're passionate about making sure that we take gun violence seriously and do something about it. You know, that's one thing that we all shared. We wanted to make sure that those people outside that building, our constituents back home who wanted us to do something about gun violence, that we lifted their voices, we stood up for them, and their voices were heard on the House floor. And that is what was in our hearts when we went to the well. And we were all compelled to make sure those voices were recognized. And so that's what we did. And we need voices that are unafraid and willing to do whatever they need to do to bring those voices of their districts to the forefront.
Tennessee State Representative Gloria Johnson, we hope you'll continue to be part of our conversations. Kim Atkinstor, thank you for being here with us. Eddie Glaude, Matt Dowd, thank you for spending time with us today. Thank you so much for letting us into your homes during these extraordinary times. We are grateful.
The battle over a woman's right to choose, global economic challenges, the ongoing threat to democracy. When you sign up for the MSNBC Daily Newsletter, you're signing up to have a deeper understanding of today's biggest issues. Every morning you'll get insightful articles sent directly to your inbox, written by people you know and trust, like Hayes Brown and Mehdi Hassan, along with video highlights from your favorite MSNBC shows. Sign up for MSNBC Daily at msnbc.com.